convener of an interagency group that has been stood up by the White House to look at issues of resilience and mitigation across the nation. And so it is great to be here and to host you all here. I'd like to thank the Iowa Water Conference for allowing us to share their space, made this useful and helpful, but also brought in a broader group of folks into this conversation today. I am joined here today along with colleagues from other federal agencies that are here on hand to help us with this. They all have roles related to mitigation. I'm not going to call them all out, but I'll highlight a few. We have folks from the Army Corps of Engineers, Scott Whitney and Pete Labone, that are here with us. Beth Freeman, the regional administrator here from Region 7, along with FEMA, has joined me. From the Department of Agriculture, Harold Decker. From the Small Business Administration, Richard Jenkins and Mark Randall. From the USGS, Kevin Richards, and from HUD, Steve Eggleston. The folks that you'll see along the way this afternoon. So I said that we are this broader group, and so yes, I'm here and I'll speak to some things particularly to FEMA, but I'm here today addressing these issues on a broader sense of what it means to address the resilience here in the nation across a whole set of agencies that you see listed there, sometimes referred to as the Mitigation Framework Leadership Group, or MITFLAG. That's who we are. So for this listening session this afternoon, I want to walk you through the objectives that we're going to play and a little bit of how the format is going to work. On Friday, January 30th of this year, President Obama signed Executive Order 13690, establishing a federal flood risk management standard and a process for further soliciting and considering stakeholder input. This order sets out a way and really directs us all to pursue a higher standard related to our resilience against flood, both looking at current and future risks, with a very specific attention to issues related to federal investments in areas of flood risk. We recognize, and in a number of you I've already seen in Washington, D.C., and others that I've met today, there have been some questions, and there have been some concerns, as well as some others who have been very pleased with elements of this. And so what we want to be able to do in this is bring clarity for us all. Address those questions where we can, better understand those places where we need to bring clarity as we look forward. So we have a number of objectives today to help us all increase that understanding. So we're going to provide you an overview, which I'll do here in just a moment, of the flood standard and kind of the need that drove us to those elements. We'll highlight the standard's approach and requirements and really begin this process, this being the first of our sessions, to solicit so we can consider your input about how we would implement this. You are an incredibly important part of this process. I say this to you very genuinely. I came here today to learn from you all about what impacts this has and how we should address these issues related to implementing. We want to hear your ideas, your thoughts, your concerns, and ways by which you would like to see us address those in very specific ways through how we implement. So, something that you all know, those who've been at the Water Conference, those who've worked in this space for quite some time, that flooding is the #1 natural disaster in the United States. Yes, we talk about things like large storms like Katrina and Sandy. Frankly, these hit large and small communities every single year. And when those floods come, they threaten our health, our safety, and the economic viability of local communities. So between 1980 and 2013, the United States suffered more than $260 billion in flood-related damages. For example, the record flooding from excessive rains in the central and northern Illinois in April of 2013 caused an estimated $1 billion in losses. We look at something like Sandy, with its high wind and the coastal surge, particularly that played out from that storm, created an estimated cost of $67 billion. And on average, more people die each year from flooding than any other natural disaster. And it doesn't stop there. With climate change, these extreme events, and other threats, we continue to see these flood risks increase. When we go out to a flood site after a disaster, I hear folks tell me, well, it's never flooded like this here before. And this is often the case, where early on they will point and say, well, it doesn't flood here, so we shouldn't have to address these standards. And then after the event, oftentimes we come back to this point that says, but it's never happened this way before. And so with this new standard, we begin to take these elements into account. The standard will reinforce elements related to critical infrastructure that we all depend on, whether that's on housing, transportation, energy, and others. And probably most importantly, it potentially helps us save lives. So, the flood standard itself. In the face of all these changing risks, we have the opportunity to bring a federal standard in line with what we know today as risks. So, the President directed federal agencies to update their flood risks reduction standards back in 2013 as part of his climate action plan. And so, over the past year, federal agencies have collaborated on how to do this. The new standard addresses and builds on the work done after Superstorm Sandy. And the standard makes these changes permanent for federal investments as we seek to address these elements. So a little bit of a history lesson for you. If we go back 38 years. So in 1977, President Jimmy Carter issues Executive Order 11988 on floodplain management. And it established protections for the nation's floodplains. And that year, the Water Resource Council, that followed in 78, they issued the floodplain management guidelines, which were these broad guidelines to federal agencies about how to implement that Executive Order 11988. In applying 11988, it recognized the need for and allowed for the consideration of the net beneficial effects. And 11988 had used the 100-year base flood elevation standard to determine where and how these requirements would apply in terms of the level of resiliency, taking the 500-year and in terms of the area of interest. So, 13690, the new executive order from January, updates some key elements of the order from 1977. And it adopts a higher flood standard for future federal investments. So on February the 5th, we published a draft revision to the floodplain management guidelines from 1978. I put that out for notice and comment. We put that document out, and we did it intentionally, rather than try to have folks wrestle between multiple documents. We laid it out in such a way so that we took these new elements and folded them into the 1978 document. We put those draft guidelines out on February the 5th. And that is the thrust of what we're now engaging in from a federal engagement in terms of the public comment period that we are now in. The executive order also requires agencies to lay out our plan of action in terms of how we will update our existing procedures or regulations to comply with these. So, in a nutshell, the goal of the standard is to ensure that the federally funded buildings and infrastructure are constructed in such a way so that they can withstand the impacts of flood. They really improve the resilience of communities and they protect federal investments. We saw this, a couple of examples I had in New York following Irene. We had a series of hospitals that received quite a bit of damage as a result of those flooding events. And through the FEMA authorities under the Stafford Act, federal dollars were invested to reconstruct or repair those buildings, which was done. Following Sandy, we went back to those same facilities, some of which, if they would have been a foot higher or had a level of flood protection just 1 or 2 feet higher, they would have withstood Sandy. But instead, we made an investment for the second time in a 5-year window. And this standard is calling on us to look at those points, particularly where there's investments on the federal side, in those things where we're doing construction work, that we need to do it in such a way so that it can withstand those kinds of future events. So, the standard does not do some things. The standard does not prohibit building in floodplains. It does, following the same thing that was in 11988, ask us to pursue that question, could we avoid the area? But particularly with those places where we can't. And so much of the nation's infrastructure and so much of our communities are inside those areas of flood risk. When that cannot happen, the new standard applies to the point that a federal fund is going to be used to build or significantly retrofit or repair structures in and around those floodplains. And it specifically requires agencies to consider both the current and the future risk when taxpayer dollars are going to be used. Now, it lays out a broad sense of how to do this. And it does it in a way that gives a tremendous amount of flexibility to federal agencies about how to apply this. Each agency will need to take the executive order and specifically these implementing guidelines that are currently out for draft and take those to lay out their way in terms of how they will implement this. The standard does not apply to private investment in structures, facilities, or homes. It has very limited impacts on the National Flood Insurance Program, so it does not change the community floodplain management requirements. It does not change how FEMA draws its flood insurance rate maps. It does not change the ratings of premiums or the availability of flood insurance. In fact, to the degree that there is an intersection with the National Flood Insurance Program, it's the point by which either they took a grant from FEMA related to elevations, and they have quite a bit that we invest each year in elevations, and this would say when you're elevating using these federal funds, you would go higher. The second one actually turns out to be a benefit, is because to the degree that a community has these standards in place, or that a home is built to be higher than the base flood elevation, in doing so, they're going to receive lower flood insurance premiums. So, what does the executive order do? It lays out a common denominator in terms of the approaches that can be put into place. It asks us to consider the best standards available, the best science that is actionable, and it really requires us to look at elevations similar to those developed by the American Society for Civil Engineers that are now being incorporated in the 2015 international codes. Today, we already see more than 350 communities across the country who meet or exceed this standard. We see a handful of states, including Indiana, Montana, New York, and Wisconsin, that already have this standard as their practice. And to the degree that a community has a higher standard than this, their standard will trump. If you go to places like Fulton County around Atlanta, Georgia, where they have a 3-foot standard in place, their standard will indeed be what guides our action in those areas. So the executive order takes these elements of the standard and says we can take one of 3 paths. We can use the best available actionable science as it pertains to that specific area or geography. We could take the existing maps and that are in place from FEMA and build to be higher. For a critical action, particularly those elements for which even the slightest risk of flooding is unacceptable, it would tell them to build it 3 feet higher. Or the 500-year flood elevation. These are common denominators, but how they get employed are things that you begin to see interpreted through the implementing guidelines that are out for draft, which we are welcoming your insights into how best to do that. And then agencies will have to go through their own process and protocols in order to see this go forward. So in addition to the higher standard, there are two other notable requirements that I'll highlight for you. It requires agencies to define these critical actions that I mentioned. And it highlights that agencies should look at those kind of nature-based approaches and how they could be used in incorporating alternatives. So we are currently in this point by which we are soliciting input, particularly from folks like yourselves. We have this out. We're out in the 6-day comment period. This is the first of 6 in-person sessions we're doing in terms of public engagement. We'll also do a virtual session as well as we do this. That comment period is open until April the 6th. And we are then directed, as the MITFLAG, this federal interagency group, to take all of this input and begin to adjudicate those comments. I have committed to do that in a transparent way by which we will take the major topics that we receive input on, and we will provide insight to folks that says these are the changes we made, or these are the kinds of comments we got by which we were not persuaded. But do it in a way by which we will be transparent with you about what we've heard and what we have done with it. Agencies will then take this document once it is finalized and published by Water Resource Council, and then move into their own implementing protocols. Some agencies will need to update regulations. Others will need to do it through policies, but all of those approaches will be done in a way that is open to the public in terms of how we should do these things. And I imagine in every instance, agencies will have further engagement with the public about how this is being implemented in their specific context. So those are the places where we're going. This is the first one here in Ames, as we will move across. We'll be in Biloxi later this week. Next week we hold sessions in both Sacramento, California, in the Hampton Roads area of Virginia. We will also do a session in Washington, D.C. the week of March 23rd, and also conduct a session in the New York metro area. So in terms of how this process is going to work today, we are going to take what we've done here and this kind of overview that I've done, and we're going to go and offer 4 breakout sessions today. And there'll be enough time for you to participate in at least 2 of those, where we'll look at each of these 4 areas. One, referring to how we apply climate-informed science in terms of that option. The second one related to determining elevation, the extent of the area of concern from a floodplain perspective. This will look at the plus 2 foot, 3 foot component as well as the 500-year element. A third conversation related to how we manage flood risk using these nature-based approaches. And a fourth on the element related to those critical actions. We have professional facilitators that will be helping us in every one of those sessions. In terms of hearing from you all, you'll have worksheets. When you're in those sessions, all of the key comments need to be written down by you. Everything you write down will be considered an official comment in this process, which means we have to take it in and we'll make sure that we're adjudicating all of those elements. We'll try to bring clarity to what those pieces are. Part of what you'll hear facilitators do is go, well, what should we change in the implementing guidelines that are out in draft? What additional information would you want to see clarity on? How would you like that to be narrowed or broadened in terms of how we understand that? Those worksheets will be collected. You'll be able to go into at least 2 of those conversations today. The facilitators will have some additional information for you on that when you're in those sessions. We will then come back into this room, and we'll also have an open period of time by which we'll be able to hear direct comments from all. So we are accepting the comments that we will today. Those written ones, as well as the statements that are made today, will all be taken as part of the official record. We are accepting those comments online and via mail. Those pieces are here on where you can find those things on regulation.gov, the docket that is published on that front, as well as places where we will be able to receive other kinds of things that come in via the mail or hand carrier. At the conclusion of the comment period, we go back to the interagency. We're going to have an interagency group. We have a lot of work to do to take in and process all the information that we have received. We will do that in a way that is transparent in terms of what we've seen and how we will ultimately adjudicate them. Section 3 of the executive order then tells the MIDFLAG to take that and send it to the Water Resource Council, who will ultimately publish the final implementing guidelines that are approved. And when implemented, that kind of compliance that we will all have as agencies will ensure that we are reducing flood risk and increasing our resilience across the country. I hope in ways that really cut these kind of future economic losses and save lives. I have received a number of questions related to the Water Resource Council. It has a long history, but let me talk about it in very practical ways. The 1977 executive order references the Water Resource Council. At one point, it was its own kind of bureaucratic entity. It is no longer that. But it is 8 cabinet-level officials, and the President has directed those 8 cabinet-level officials come together, and they will be the final review to approve these pieces when it is convened. You'll see the list of the various agencies that are brought together. So, you got a timeline here about where we're going as we approach that time period between now and April the 6th. So afterwards, I'll talk a little bit about what we will do as agencies, but there's one other element that I've been asked questions about. The executive order directs agencies to develop implementing plans. And those are due 30 days after the close of the comment period. So let me tell you very plainly what is due at 30 days after. Each of the agencies owe back to the White House their plan of action with milestones of how they will address the key elements related to their policies. We each have to identify, do we have specific programs that we know this will have an impact on? We'll have to identify whether or not we'll have to make adjustments to our regulations or through policy, and we'll have to articulate what further engagement with the public will look like and how we will make sure that we continue to move this through on a timely basis. Those implementing plans are just that. It's a plan with our milestones. It's when and how we will come to conclusions and decisions. It is not the policy-making decision that is there, but rather it is just our plan of action in terms of how we will, and I know in my agency, it will take us many months to be able to take this and see it all the way through to effect. And ultimately, none of this is implemented until we have engaged with you all in this process. So, we will walk you through these breakouts here in a moment. I'm going to turn things to Sam McGill, who will walk us through these pieces. But what I want to leave you with is a piece directly from the beginning of the order. And the beginning of the order tells us that it is the policy of the United States to improve the resilience of communities and federal assets against the impact of flooding. I know it's true for my agency at FEMA particularly, but for many others. It says the viability and sustainability of communities matters. And we know the kind of impact, kind of devastation flooding can have. And we said it's the policy of this nation to improve that level of resilience. And we know that this is changing. Some of it we can tie back to the issues and changes in our climate. I'll be honest with you, many communities I go with as they deal with growth and additional construction, as we try to accommodate the next 50 million people who live in this country. We need to do that in such a way so that we have built higher and stronger so that they can withstand these kind of events. Understanding that ultimately it is the economic prosperity of the nation that we're trying to seek. We want to make sure that we provide for the public health and safety of our citizens. Because ultimately, when our country is vibrant, it's the point by which we're our best posture from both a national security perspective and for the viability of our communities. So I'm going to turn it to Sam, who's going to walk us through the specifics of how the breakout process will work, and then we'll be back together, and I'll be with you on at that point.
Thanks, Roy. All right. Thank you all for joining us here today. As Roy mentioned, the focus and the real chance for many of you to brainstorm some ideas is during these breakout sessions. So as Roy mentioned, there's going to be an opportunity for all of you to brainstorm ideas around each of the 4 topic areas. We have climate science and how it applies to the guidelines. We have critical actions over here in the corner. Right in the back here, we have natural approaches. And then out those double doors in the back, we have floodplain elevations. So the purpose here is for agency support staff to answer questions as they relate to the guidelines in each of these topic areas. And the most important thing to mention, which Roy already went over, is that if you have specific comments or things that you want to see changed in the guidelines, you need to record those on the worksheets that you gathered at the front table there. So just real quickly, I want to introduce you to some of the other facilitators that will be helping with the breakout groups. For climate science, we have Katie Cox. For critical action, we have Gia Brazil. For natural approaches, we have Debbie Lee. And then again, my name is Sam McGill, and I'll be assisting with the floodplain elevation discussion outside. Just real quickly, given the limitations on space that we have in here, I wanted to run through the process for moving to all of those groups. During registration, hopefully all of you signed up for 2 topic areas. It doesn't matter if you didn't, but can I get a quick show of hands for everyone interested in climate science real quickly? Okay, great. How about the critical actions group over here? And natural approaches in the back there? Okay, very good. And then floodplain elevation. That's the big one. Not a big surprise on that one. What I will ask, one more time, can you raise your hands for that last group? Okay. For the first breakout session that we're going to transfer to in just a moment here, can I have everybody who raised their hands on the left side join that first breakout group? And everybody on the right side, if you could please join the second breakout session around floodplain elevation. That way we can just make sure that all of you are in one space at once. And feel free to filter into the other groups. Does that make sense to everyone? Great. After that second discussion, so we'll go through one round of brainstorming. After the second discussion, we're going to reconvene for a brief public comment period. To make sure you have as much time in those breakout sessions as possible, the comment period at the end is currently limited to 30 minutes. We'll try to extend that a little bit if we can, but just be aware, many of you filled out some speaker cards. I'm going to be selecting those at random, and we'll run through the cards as we receive them for you to get an additional round of official comment in with the stenographer up here who's going to be typing verbatim all of your comments. Okay. Just a couple of quick discussion guidelines as we move through it. While it is really helpful to receive comments on the guidelines generally, the more specific you can be, the more useful they're going to be as FEMA goes and revises them and makes recommendations to the mid-flag. So please, as you're filling in your comment sheet, as you're speaking here in front of the room, do really get down to the level of what you'd actually like to see changed, what specifically you like about the guidelines, and maybe what you need more information on. I would also ask if everybody could just take out their phones really quickly. I'm guilty of this all the time, but we have a lot of people here in the room. If you could please put those on silent or on vibrate. If you do need to take a call, I just ask that you step down the hallway to do that. There's a bunch of us in the room here, and we want to make sure we're not interrupting the conversation as much as possible. And then just one final thing before we go ahead and break. We have 3 groups in the room here. As you can imagine, it can get loud pretty quickly. So I'll ask that everybody tries to use what I'll just call a 3-foot voice. If you can hear me farther than 3 feet away, I'm probably speaking a little bit too loudly. So with that, let me look to Roy and other FEMA staff and agency staff and see if you have any comments or questions before we break up here. All right. Any very brief questions? We don't want to take public comments here, but any questions about the process itself before we break? Yes, sir.
Are the breakout groups going to have some review of what the comments were in the group so that all of us can hear them?
Unfortunately, there's not time to do that right now, but hopefully we can. We'll put our heads together and try to give you just a real brief, sentence or two overview of what we heard. But we do need to keep rolling through the process, so there won't be extended time to summarize all of the discussions. Yes, that's right.
We already have several succinct comments typed out on your sheet. Can you just attach those to the comment sheet?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Any other questions about the process? We do need to go ahead and break here pretty quickly. Okay. Well, with that, again, climate science in the front, critical action, natural approaches, and then outside.
Well,